Welcome to Veritate with your host, Johnny Mack, a podcast that will dive deep into the pursuit of truth in a world filled with noise, confusion, and fleeting opinions. We will seek to uncover the eternal, unshakable truths that shape our lives and our beliefs, from faith and philosophy to history and culture. We'll explore the questions that matter, challenge the answers we've been given, and seek the wisdom that has stood the test of time. So join Johnny Mack in this journey to discover what's real, what's right, and what's true.
Merry Christmas from Veritate, and this is your host, Johnny Mack. I'm going to start this week with a claim that I think is very appropriate, and that is Santa Claus is real. And I want to start there on purpose. I'm not starting there as a joke, and I'm not starting there as nostalgia or anything else. I want to state a claim that needs to be stated cleanly before anything else will make sense. And that's because most people will hear the sentence and immediately think in an extreme. They'll either have blind belief or they'll have complete dismissal. But that is the problem, because we've been trained to think that reality only exists at two shallow levels, either a literal material object or pure fiction. But what I've learned is that the church has never thought this way. Santa Claus is real because what you were told about him has been distorted. Now, this distortion doesn't come from malice at first. It came from simplification. And what simplification does is it removes the weight. But children always sense something is true at Christmas. They sense the generosity. They sense the joy. They sense the expectation. And that response is not manufactured. It's not a result of clever marketing alone, because children respond to reality more easily than adults do because they have not been trained to distrust wonder. Now, if Santa Claus were just pure invention, that response would not persist across cultures and centuries, because it would collapse the moment that pressure gets applied to it. And notice that it hasn't collapsed, that Santa Claus has endured. And that endurance should tell you something is real underneath the surface. Now, Santa Claus did not begin as a costume, and he certainly didn't begin as a character. He actually began as a man who lived, a man who believed, a man who acted. And he's left a mark on history that cannot be erased. Now, his name is Saint Nicholas. Now, this matters because when I say that Santa Claus is real, it doesn't mean that every detail that people imagine is literal. It actually means something far more serious. It means that a real person existed whose life has created a pattern. And the pattern got carried forward just imperfectly, but faithfully enough that it still produces recognizable fruit. Now, the modern world is uncomfortable with this kind of reality because it prefers things that's either provable under a microscope or dismissed outright. That was the problem with my atheism. But every year, Christmas itself refuses that limitation, because Christmas claims that God entered into history and that the invisible became visible and that heaven touched the earth. So if you accept Christmas, you already accept that the reality is deeper than materialism. And so when I say that Santa Claus is real, I'm not lowering the bar for truth. I'm just going to raise it back up to where it belongs. Saint Nicholas was a saint. And that matters because a saint's not a mascot. A saint is someone that the Catholic Church has declared is alive in God. And that doesn't mean they're remembered. It means they are alive. Even Protestants would agree that to be absent from the body is to be present with God. And so Saint Nicholas is alive. And I know that's where many people hesitate at, because they've been trained to think that death ends the influence. But the church teaches something opposite. And that is that death does not end communion. It actually intensified. So Saint Nicholas didn't stop loving children when he died. And he didn't stop caring about generosity. He did not stop rejoicing in the birth of Jesus. And the reason why is because saints do not lose their character in heaven. They become fully themselves. And that is why the claim that Santa Claus is real is not a childish claim. It's actually theological. Because what people were told about Santa Claus has flattened this reality out. It's reduced the living saint to a symbol. And while symbols can still point to truth, they cannot carry weight on their own forever. And eventually someone has to restore the source. And that's what I'm hoping to do in this episode. I'm not here to tear down any childhood joy. I'm just here to explain why that joy exists at all. I'm not here to mock belief. We're here to discipline it. Because ordered belief lasts and disordered belief collapses. Now, St. Nicholas, he never wanted attention for himself. He never gave anything to be seen, and he never acted to build a legend. He acted because he believed something about Jesus that demanded a response. He believed that belief produces generosity, that it produces courage, that it produces joy. So Santa Claus did not replace St. Nicholas. Santa Claus is St. Nicholas. He's just remembered through time, through language and culture, but he softened where the conviction once stood. So I want to set the ground rules. Santa Claus is real, and St. Nicholas is real, and Christmas works because reality is deeper than what you've been taught. So now we have to discipline. The Catholic Church defines what is real. And before we go any further, we have to fix this broken definition because most modern people think they know what real means. And they usually mean this. If I can touch it, if I can measure it, or if I can prove it in a lab, it's real. And if I can, it's imaginary, it's symbolic, or it's emotional. And that definition is actually recent, by the way, but it's also shallow. And it certainly cannot explain Christmas because the church has never used that definition. The church actually defines reality more honestly. It says that reality is not limited to matter. Reality includes being. And that is why the Catholic Church can say all of this following without any contradiction. God is real. Love is real. Truth is real. Justice is real. Heaven is real. Saints are real. And none of those things can be weighed. And yet all of them shape the world. And if you deny that, you don't become more rational. You become blind to half of existence. And if we take that application and we apply it to Christmas, Christmas claims that God became man. Not symbolically, not metaphorically. He literally became man. That the invisible entered the visible. That somehow eternity stepped into time. And if that's true, then reality cannot be limited to what fits inside of a box. And this is where many adults, including myself, struggle. Because I wanted Christmas sentiment without Christmas ontology. I wanted a feeling without the claim. And you got to understand that tension creates confusion. And children don't have that problem because they haven't yet been trained to amputate reality. And now I want to bring St. Nicholas into this. So when the church declares someone a saint, she's not saying that this person is remembered fondly. The church is claiming that this person is alive in God. The church is saying that death did not erase them and that communion continues. That's doctrine. And what do saints do? They intercede for us. They rejoice. They remain involved. St. Nicholas is a saint. And so that means that his love for Jesus didn't end. It means his love for children didn't end. It means that his generosity didn't end. And so when people ask whether Santa Claus is real, the church answers in a way that the modern world would not expect. Yes. Because the man behind the name is alive in Christ. Not alive as a myth, not alive as a memory, alive as a person that's been perfected in God. And that matters because it explains why certain things about St. Nicholas endure. Ask yourself, why does generosity surge at Christmas, even among people who claim not to believe? And why do children instinctively expect goodness? Why does the idea of a giver who comes quietly in the middle of the night still resonate? Those things can't be sustained by marketing alone. Look, marketing burns out. Trends die. I've sat in many meetings of trying to figure out how to repurpose something, how to rebrand something, how to bring it back. But what endures is what corresponds to reality. And St. Nicholas corresponds to reality because his life was ordered to truth. And here's where clarity matters. When I say that Santa Claus is real, it doesn't mean that everything people imagine is literal. And the church doesn't ask you to confuse categories. What she asks you to do is to respect them. A saint can be alive without riding a sleigh. A spirit can influence without being material. And a pattern can endure without every detail being historical. That's how the church thinks. Now, modern people today struggle with this because they were trained poorly. They were taught that imagination somehow equals falsehood. And the church teaches that imagination is often how truth first reaches the heart. Christmas uses imagination to prepare the soul for reality. And St. Nicholas fits that pattern perfectly. He's real. His life mattered. His charity mattered. And his faith mattered. And the modern world flattened him out because it doesn't know how to handle living saints. All the modern world knows how to do is to sell an image. It doesn't know how to submit to truth. I'm not arguing sentiment. We're not protecting nostalgia. We're restoring a correct understanding of reality. And if you accept Christmas, you already accept that framework. So now, I want to talk about the part that almost everyone knows, but almost no one understands correctly. St. Nicholas, he did give generously. That statement's true. St. Nicholas gave generously. Now that statement's true, but it's incomplete. Because generosity can come from many places. From comfort, from excess, from guilt. It can even come from vanity. But St. Nicholas gave from conviction. St. Nicholas lived in a world that did not protect the weak automatically. There were no safety nets. There was no system in place to catch people when they fell. There was no WIC. There was no family-run program of welfare. If a family collapsed, it collapsed completely. And you have to keep that in mind because the most enduring story associated with St. Nicholas involves a poor man and his 3 daughters. So this man had no wealth. His daughters had no dowries. And in that culture, a dowry was not a custom. It was a protection. And so without it, marriage was impossible. And without marriage, their future was not abstractly difficult. It was dangerous. Poverty didn't lead to inconvenience. It led to exploitation. And Nicholas knew this. And here's the important part about it. He didn't announce his concern to everybody. And he certainly didn't organize any public responses. He didn't turn charity into performance. St. Nicholas acted quietly. And so at night, Nicholas goes to the family's home and he delivers a gift of gold. He delivered enough for a dowry. He delivered enough to change the course of a life. And then he left. No name, no credit, no recognition. And he did this more than once. And every time he did it quietly. And each time he did it deliberately. And that matters because it tells you how St. Nicholas understood. Giving was not about feeling generous. It was about a responsibility. What St. Nicholas understood is that having means created an obligation. And he understood that believing in Christ demands action. And he understood that protecting dignity mattered more than being thanked. And so that's why this story endured. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was moral. And that's also where much of the Christmas imagery originates. Think about it. Gifts given at night, gifts given in secret. Those details didn't come from fantasy writers. They came from memory. Now think for a minute, and I want you to notice something important about this. St. Nicholas did not give indiscriminately. He gave wisely. He gave where harm could be prevented. And he gave where dignity could be preserved. He gave where silence was more charitable than speech. And that is disciplined charity. And it's also why children respond to the idea of Santa Claus so easily. They instinctively understand that the giver comes quietly. The giver comes without demand and disappears without praise. So what children are responding to is a moral pattern. And that pattern came from St. Nicholas. And that's why the church never treated his generosity as separate from his holiness. Giving wasn't an accessory to his faith, it was a consequence of it. Now, what did St. Nicholas believe? St. Nicholas believed that Jesus became poor for our sake. He believed that every soul had an eternal value. He believed that faith requires action. So he acted. And that is the root of why giving is inseparable from his name. Not because he liked gifts, but because he understood obligation. Charity for St. Nicholas was not optional. It was obedience. Now, there's something else you need to know about St. Nicholas. So up to this point, St. Nicholas sounds pretty safe, right? He gives quietly. He protects the vulnerable. He acts without recognition. And most people are comfortable with that version of him. But what makes people uncomfortable is that the same man who gave so gently also defended Jesus with absolute seriousness. So St. Nicholas also lived at a time when Christianity was still being defined publicly. And what people believed about Jesus was not settled by habit. It was argued openly. It was taught publicly, and it was contested fiercely. Now that matters because when you live close to the truth, you also live close to the danger of error. And it was at the Council of Nicaea, when a group of leaders of the church gathered together to confront a teaching that threatened the heart of Christianity. There was a priest named Arius, and he taught that Jesus was not fully God. Arius claimed that Jesus was created and that there was a time when he did not exist. St. Nicholas understood immediately what was at stake with this. He understood that if Jesus is not God, then he cannot save. And if he cannot save, then the cross has no power. And if the cross has no power, then Christmas is reduced to just a sentiment. This was not a debate about words. It was a question of reality. And St. Nicholas did not respond with indifference. He didn't say that all opinions were equally valid, and he also didn't remain silent to keep the peace. St. Nicholas stood up for Jesus because Jesus mattered. Now hear this carefully. Standing up for Jesus was not separate from his charity. It was the same obedience that he had. It's just expressed a little differently. St. Nicholas believed that the truth protects people just as surely as generosity does. And false teaching harms the soul the same way that poverty harms the body. Now, both of these demand a response. And that's where modern people struggle. Modern people are comfortable with generosity, but they're uneasy with conviction. And St. Nicholas refused that separation. He understood that love without truth becomes sentiment and truth without love becomes cruelty. He lived both. And again, that's why the church remembers him as a saint, not simply as a kind man. Because now kindness alone doesn't make a saint. Fidelity does. And St. Nicholas accepted the consequences for defending Jesus the way that he did. Because what did he do when Arius made this claim? St. Nicholas punched Arius in the mouth. And he got thrown out of the Council of Nicaea. But he accepted that. He got corrected by the authority and he submitted to the church. He didn't act as a rebel. He acted as a servant. And that matters for Christmas. Because Christmas is not merely about warmth. It's about the truth entering into the world. God becomes man. Light enters the darkness and reality asserts itself. And St. Nicholas defended the truth because without it, nothing else he did would have meaning. So modern people want St. Nicholas divided. They want the giver without the conviction. They want the generosity without doctrine. And they want warmth without truth. And that division does not exist in real holiness. St. Nicholas did not live two lives. He lived one ordered life. And the same belief that moved him to give in secret moved him to speak when truth was threatened. That same obedience that led him into the night with those gifts led him into the public disagreement when Jesus was denied. That's not contradiction, that's coherence. Because St. Nicholas believed something very specific. And so do you. If you listen to this show, you do. Jesus is God. God became man. Every soul, therefore, has an eternal value. And actions in this life matter forever. And so once you believe that, neutrality is impossible. Because if Jesus is truly God, then truth is not optional. And if souls are eternal, then charity is also not optional. And that's why St. Nicholas didn't calculate reputation. He calculated responsibility. St. Nicholas didn't ask, will this make me liked? He asked, is this required of me? And this is where the world becomes uncomfortable because the world prefers selective virtue. The world likes generosity when it costs nothing. And it tolerates belief as long as it remains private. And it praises kindness as long as it never judges error. But St. Nicholas would not accept that arrangement. He understood falsehood harms people even when it sounds gentle. He also understood that silence can become complicity. And he understood that love sometimes requires clarity. But at the same time, he understood that clarity without charity becomes tyranny. And so what did he do? He lived both. He gave without humiliating people. He defended without hatred. He obeyed authority even when he was corrected. He accepted discipline without resentment. That's not being soft. That's strength under control. And that's why the church canonized him. Not because he was pleasant, but because he was faithful. And that also explains why later generations tried to separate these traits. A man who gives generously but never speaks truth is easy to celebrate. But a man who defends truth without compassion is easy to condemn. A man who does both unsettles everyone. And St. Nicholas unsettles because he exposes the false choice. You are not allowed to pick truth or love. You are commanded to live both. And that's why his memory has endured even when his meaning is faded. Because the pattern of his life is too real to erase completely. So now, I have to address what most people never ask, and that is, how did St. Nicholas then become Santa Claus? St. Nicholas lived in a Greek-speaking world. Okay, his name was Nikolaos. Names matter because they carry meaning, and his name means victory of the people. And that alone can help explain why his name has endured. But as devotion to Nicholas spread, his name starts to travel with it. And as Christianity starts to move across borders, so did the saint. When the Greek moves into Latin, all of a sudden Nikolaos becomes Sanctus Nicholas, Saint Nicholas. Again, history. This is history. And so centuries passed, and devotion to St. Nicholas starts to spread across Europe. And especially among families, among sailors and children, people did not stop talking about him. So they told stories, they named churches, and they taught their children to imitate his generosity. And when the name enters into the Dutch language, St. Nicholas then becomes Santa Claus. Now let me say that slowly for you. Santa Claus. That's not a nickname, that's a pronunciation. And Dutch families were not inventing a new figure. They were honoring the same saint, it's just in their own language. And then history moves again. So the Dutch settlers, they carry this devotion to the New World into a place that was called New Amsterdam, what we today call New York. And so when English speakers hear the name, they adapted it. Santa Claus became Santa Claus. And that happened by habit because that's how language works. The name shifted, the memory endures. Now what matters is that Santa Claus didn't replace St. Nicholas. Santa Claus is St. Nicholas carried through language, through culture, and through time. That explains why certain things stayed attached to him, like the giving, the children, the quiet arrival, the surprise without demand. Those details didn't survive by accident. They survived because they were already part of the man. What did change was the emphasis, because now as language starts to shift, the meaning starts to thin, the culture speeds up, the depth fades. All of a sudden, the bishop's authority softens and the theological seriousness gets blurred, but the root is still in place. And that's why the idea of Santa Claus has never collapsed into nonsense, because even stripped down, the figure still points to generosity. It still points to goodness. It still points to this expectation, and that only happens when something real sits underneath. So the name Santa Claus is not a lie. It's just an echo. It's an echo of a saint who lived, who believed, who gave, who defended truth. Now, once St. Nicholas became Santa Claus, the figure didn't disappear. He starts to spread. And of course, when something starts to spread widely, two things happen at the same time. It becomes familiar, and then it becomes simplified. And that's where the distortion begins. Because the modern world didn't destroy St. Nicholas. What it did was it reduced him. It kept him pleasant. It removed what was demanding. And you see this pattern everywhere. The world is comfortable with generosity. Again, uneasy with authority. The world enjoys joy, but it resists the truth that requires the obedience. So the image changed. The bishop faded, the fasting disappeared, the discipline softened, and the defense of Jesus fell silent. And what remained was the giving. Now, giving without truth, and that's not accidental. Giving without truth is easy to celebrate. Joy without sacrifice is easy to sell. Warmth without doctrine is easy to consume. So the world emphasized color and cheer and abundance and humor, but it didn't need to attack St. Nicholas. It only needed to remove the parts of him that made him serious. And that's how distortion works. You don't lie outright, you edit selectively. So the saint became a symbol, and then the man became a mascot. And here's the important point. Even distorted, the figure still works, because children still expected generosity. Families still gather together. People still give more freely than any other time of the year. And that tells you something critical. Again, that the root has never been destroyed. So now if Santa Claus were just pure invention, that joy would feel hollow, and it would fade quickly. It wouldn't survive generations of cultural change, but for some reason it did survive. Because the generosity was real. The joy was real. The expectation of goodness is real. And all of that came from St. Nicholas. Now, distortion has thinned out the meaning, but it didn't eliminate the source. And that's why the solution is not rejection, it's restoration. We don't throw away Christmas because it was commercialized. You reclaim what gave it strength in the first place. St. Nicholas wasn't opposed to joy. He was the foundation. Now, children are not wrong to believe. Look, children believe easily, and that's not a flaw. That's a strength. Because they're trained to be suspicious of everything. Children recognize patterns of goodness instinctively. They respond to generosity, to surprise, to the idea that someone gave without demanding any repayment. That's not irrational. That's human. Children don't analyze Santa Claus. They receive him. They receive the idea that goodness comes looking for you, that gifts can arrive without being earned, and that joy can be given freely. Those ideas are not false. Those are deeply Christian ideas. And that's why children are not wrong to believe. They're responding to the moral truth long before they have the language to explain it. And St. Nicholas understood that. He gave quietly because he knew that goodness does not need announcement. And he acted in ways that preserved innocence rather than destroying it. He protected children not only with gifts, but with discretion. Now, this matters for parents. You do not protect children by exposing everything too early. You protect them by ordering truth properly. There's a difference between lying and mystery. And the church understands that distinction well. God did not reveal everything at once. God reveals truth in stages. And Christmas is just one example of this. God comes first as a child, not as a judge. Because wonder prepares the soul for truth. And Santa Claus functions in the same way. He teaches generosity before economics. He teaches gift before transaction. And he teaches joy before explanation. That's not opposite of truth. That does not oppose truth. It prepares for it. And that's why tearing Santa Claus down in the name of honesty often does harm. It confuses cynicism with maturity. St. Nicholas would never rush a child into adult skepticism. St. Nicholas would guide them patiently toward deeper understanding. So when children believe, they're not believing something false. They're believing something incomplete in the right order. And that incompleteness is not deception, it's development. So children receive, adults are responsible. And at some point, wonder must be integrated with truth, not erased. It must be ordered. And that's where many adults fail. They either cling to the sentiment and refuse to grow, or they swing hard into cynicism and destroy what they don't understand. And both of those are forms of immaturity. St. Nicholas demands something better. Adults are required to do the harder work. You have to hold two things at once: protect the innocence and restore the truth. And that requires discipline. You have to understand that Santa Claus didn't fail because he was false. He was weakened because adults forgot why he existed in the first place. St. Nicholas didn't give because it felt good. St. Nicholas gave because Christ became poor for our sake. St. Nicholas didn't defend Jesus because he was angry. He defended Jesus because truth saves souls. And if you remove Christ, generosity becomes charity theater. If you remove truth, joy becomes noise. Adults are called to restore meaning without cruelty. You do not mock belief. You don't sneer at tradition. You do not expose mystery as if exposure itself were a virtue. You instruct by example. You give quietly. You speak truth clearly. You accept inconvenience. You place Christ at the center. That's what St. Nicholas did. Adults often say they want their children to be good, but then they model comfort instead of courage. And what St. Nicholas does is he exposes that contradiction, because goodness costs something. It costs discipline. It costs clarity. It costs saying no when the world wants indulgence. It costs saying yes when obedience is inconvenient. St. Nicholas did not outsource responsibility. He acted. That's the adult lesson of Santa Claus. So if you want the joy to remain real, you must live what created it. Everything we've said comes down to order. When things are out of order, they decay. And when they're ordered rightly, they endure. Christmas only works when it's ordered. Christ at the center. Saints as witnesses. Joy as fruit. Giving as a response. St. Nicholas fits perfectly into that order. St. Nicholas never competed with Christ. He never drew attention to himself. He never replaced the nativity. He stood beside it. St. Nicholas mattered because Jesus was born, and his generosity flowed from the incarnation. His defense of truth flowed from the reality of who Jesus is. That's why Santa Claus still works, even after the distortion, because the root was never severed. So when a child feels wonder at Christmas, that wonder is not misplaced. It's aimed, even if it's imperfect, it's aimed toward goodness, generosity, and expectation. And those things do not contradict the gospel. They come from it. So when an adult gives more freely at Christmas, that impulse is not foolish. It's a response to grace, even if the person can't articulate it. St. Nicholas stands quietly behind all of that, not as a myth and not as a mascot, but as a witness. And he's a witness to this truth. Belief produces charity. Truth produces joy. Love requires action. And Christ changes everything. You do not keep Christmas by tearing that down. You keep it by putting them in the right place. If Christ is removed, Santa Claus becomes hollow. But if St. Nicholas is remembered, joy regains weight. If adults live truthfully, children remain protected. That is not nostalgia, that is continuity. Santa Claus is real. St. Nicholas is real. And both of those make sense only because a child was born in Bethlehem. That's not fantasy. That is reality, rightly understood. In nomine Patri, Filii, Spiritui Sancti. Saint Nicholas, faithful servant of Christ and true shepherd of souls, you defended the truth of who Jesus is, and you gave generously to those in need. You believed when truth was challenged, and you gave when generosity cost you something. Teach us to do the same. Pray for us. Pray for parents that they may protect innocence and raise their children in truth and love. Pray for children that their joy may remain pure and lead them toward goodness and toward God. You gave quietly, preserving the dignity of the vulnerable. Teach us to give without seeking praise and to love without counting the cost. As we celebrate the birth of Jesus this Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas, St. Nicholas. And we ask that you visit us in spirit. Share with us your spirit of generosity, your courage to stand for truth, and your joy rooted in faith. Help us always place Christ at the center, to order our lives according to the gospel, and to give because we believe. Saint Nicholas, pray for us. In nomine Patri, et Filii, et Spiritui Sancti. Amen. Merry Christmas.
Thank you for listening to Veritate. If you would like to contact the show, please email us at veritate@yahoo.com. That's veritate@yahoo.com. Thanks again, and we look forward to hearing from you. May God bless you all.